Hey everybody, it's me. I'm here with an overview of next month's Great Artist lesson. Our 3rd through 5th grade students will be continuing the Famous Artist series, and they will be learning about a German-American landscape painter by the name of Albert Bierstadt, who was famous for his very lavish and beautiful paintings of the American West. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go a little bit over the lesson itself, and then I will talk about the project. First, we talk about the basics of the artist and talk about where he was born and the fact that he was born in Germany, but he, at a very young age, he and his family moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts. He was not one of these child prodigies. He was an average Joe who worked an average Joe job. He was a carpenter who built frames and he decorated cakes. But at the age of 20, he had an interest in art and he started doing monochromatic paintings, which are black and white paintings, and he had a huge following, but ultimately he knew that he needed more training. And it's always good to kind of explain to the kids that art, of course, can come naturally, but with more training and more education, you can become an even better artist. And that's kind of the point of this particular slide. So here we go on to continue his tale and talk about the fact that he did go pursue that training. He went back to Germany to Dusseldorf Art Academy, and unfortunately for him, there were a lot of critics, people who didn't particularly like his style of painting. And he was like, you know what, I'm going to do me. He put a backpack on, packed up his supplies, and he went out for the European countryside. And he would make these drawings and he would pack them up, bring them back with him, and 5 months after being out in the countryside, he came back and he painted, and this is an example here that you see. This is the Matterhorn in Switzerland. So he would come back and he would take these drawings and he would paint these large canvas paintings and he would send them back to people in Massachusetts. And it was a type of art that people in Massachusetts hadn't seen. So he was a ginormous success in spite of the fact that his classmates and his professors didn't find him to be a particularly good artist. So because he did it his way, he found his own personal success. Next, we talk about how he came back to America and a road trip with somebody sparked a lifelong passion. He had the opportunity to go west, which is something that really intrigued him, and he went with a government surveyor, a land surveyor, and he fell in love with the American West, which is known as Wyoming. He fell in love with everything that he saw, the rugged mountains, the wild scenery, and he had decided once he saw these beautiful scenic colors and textures, that this was something that he wanted to paint for the rest of his life. At this point, we use one of our printed pictures, our printed paintings, and we just have a little bit of a discussion about that print and ask the kids to look at it, and you can point out things how when Albert Bierstadt painted things, he liked to dramatize things. He wanted to impress people who had never been there, because going west and taking a 2,000-mile trip like this was kind of unheard of. So this was his way of kind of painting the colors and the pictures for people who would never have the opportunity to see the Wild West. So you want to have a discussion about that print and point out, which is something unbelievable, that in that day and time, back at this time, he sold that particular painting for $25,000, which is, wow, a lot of money would be considered today. And back then it was unheard of. So there he was, riding high on success. He built himself a castle, a 35-room castle. And it was on the Hudson River, and he gave these lavish parties for royals and aristocrats. And then, boom, he was no longer in style. His art was considered passé, and his beautiful, wonderful castle burned down. And before you knew it, the man who had everything, and the man who had all these riches and all this success, had to file bankruptcy. The police came and they seized all of his property, and sadly, he went from riches to rags. Here we continue on with this cautionary tale of success. Well, for poor Mr. Bierstadt, he became unknown and he died. And when he died, no one knew In fact, as you can see here in 1902, I did not know he was alive until I saw he had died. This is what an art critic had said. So he was just such a well sought after landscape artist, but in death, unfortunately, he was no longer remembered until it was too late. And then sadly, 40 years later, all these beautiful, wonderful landscape paintings that everyone used to want and desired and paid $25,000 for, they sold. 100 of his paintings sold at an auction for $2 each. Fast forward 2 decades later, and there became this renewed interest in American art, and the last Buffalo painting sold for $1,870,000. So he definitely, like most artists, had a rebirth after death. All right, so now we transition out of talking about the tale of the artist into setting them up for the art project that they'll be doing. And here we just kind of touch on the idea of what is called atmospheric perspective. And this is going to set them up for the art project that they're going to be doing. So we can use our sample that we have and also the printed artwork that we have to kind of demonstrate this atmospheric perspective, what is called the background, the middle ground, and the foreground. Explaining that as things get further away, things become lighter, and as they come closer, things become darker. And so this is going to play into their own landscape watercolor painting that they're going to be doing, because we want them to paint a foreground that is darker and then take it back to the middle ground and then all the way back to the background. But when we paint it, we start from the back and we go forward. So it's just letting them see in the samples that we have and in the paintings that we have and in the example that we have here, having that discussion and making sure that they understand that in order to create a robust landscape, they have to have this atmospheric perspective in place. All right, it's project time. And before we get into the actual project, first and foremost, we don't want to pass out any supplies until we've explained the project completely. And that starts off with us giving them some watercoloring tips. When it comes to watercolors, the kids tend to load paint onto their brush and not enough water, so that brush doesn't wiggle across the paper like it should to make that beautiful diluted color come out. So we want to give them the tip of using the lid of their watercoloring tray. They can pick up some paint and put a little bit of extra water in it and dilute it into their tray so that when they run that brush across the paper, it's diluted and beautiful and fluid. That's the whole idea behind watercolors. So we want to give them those watercoloring tips, and then we want to break down the project. We want them to do a landscape, and the one that we are hoping that they will do is the top one that you see here, which is the sky, some mountains, some trees, and then the water. And there are those kids who aren't going to want to do this, they're going to want to do their own thing, and that's fine, as long as they stick to the concept of a landscape. They have to do a landscape, and they have to go from that background all the way down to the foreground, the light color to the dark color, just like landscape artists do. So we want to break it down for them. The first quarter of the page right here is, let me see if I can do this. Ooh, use my tools here. The first quarter of the page is the sky. They want to use the lightest of light colors, the most diluted paint that they have. And then they get into part of the middle ground that we have here. A quarter of this page is the middle ground here. That's kind of where the sky starts to turn a little bit. And then they can get into some mountains and some trees. So that's what we have here, some mountains with peaks and trees. And then lastly, that foreground, which we have here, which we want them to do is water, if they're doing this particular project. We want them to have that water really concentrated, very blue. But again, they still need water in that brush to make it glide across the paper appropriately. Now, of course, before they do anything, they even pick up a brush, the first and foremost thing that they need to do is put their name on the back. This is a wet project, so which means once they're done and they want to turn that paper over because they forgot to put their name on it, it's going to be a little more difficult. Well, that's the project. You got water, you've got watercolors, and you got a paper and your imagination. That's it. If you have any comments, questions, or if you want me to go over anything with you, by all means, let me know. Otherwise, happy creating, and I will see you in the hallways. Bye.